Well, you may have to wait a while longer if you want to catch a movie at a multiplex near you, but if you happen to be a fitness freak or a yoga enthusiast, there is good news. Yoga centers and gyms outside of containment zones can restart operations from the 5th of August. However, there are caveats attached. According to the Home Ministry's guidelines, fitness centers have been encouraged to offer outdoor facilities to patrons as far as possible. Pregnant women, persons above 65, people with comorbidities and children below 10 have been advised not to use gyms or yoga institutes, especially those that operate within closed spaces. Additionally, these yoga and fitness centers will have to institute social distancing, thermal screening and other hygiene etiquette. That's not all. For group fitness sessions, staggered timing should be allocated in order to avoid overcrowding while entering or exiting the fitness center. Each batch should be spaced 15 to 30 minutes apart to facilitate cleaning and disinfecting of the premises. Members have been encouraged to carry separate workout shoes. The guidelines further mention that spas, sauna, steam bath and swimming pool facilities will remain closed till further notice. Well, we caught up with Mukesh Bansal, the CEO at CureFit, to find out how CureFit is preparing to welcome back its customers.
Definitely welcome news that finally, I think government is lifting restriction for all the businesses. But we want to be very cautious about this. The pandemic is still very much among us. It's growing, and we are seeing the spike in cases, etc. And gyms are places where people congregate. So we want to be very careful and watchful. What we'll do is we'll take next couple of weeks to assess the situation. We will see. We have already come up with all of our protocols around hygiene standards, sanitization. We had shared it with the government. A lot of them are actually factored into guidelines. So on one hand, we feel fully prepared that we can create safe environment for our customers. But having said that, we still want to be very cautious.
Well, move with caution, and that is probably going to be the way forward as far as gyms, fitness centers and yoga institutes are concerned. Now, India's manufacturing output has contracted at a sharper pace in July compared to June. The India Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index released by IHS Markit stood at 46 in July compared to 47.2 in June. A PMI of below 50 signals a contraction. India's manufacturing activity has now seen 4 consecutive months of contraction. The May PMI stood at 30.8. However, manufacturing activity in July has contracted at a faster pace when compared to June. This could partly be attributed to localized lockdowns imposed by several state governments, and this is something that a lot of our experts have been cautioning us about. Former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Praveen Chakravarty, the chairperson of the Congress Data Analytics Department, have suggested that a direct cash transfer into the hands of the non-agriculture workers who've been hit hard due to the lockdown will help restore confidence and help boost the economy. Dr. Singh and Chakravarty, who co-authored an opinion piece in The Hindu, have written that India cannot afford to be too fiscally restrained in these times, and therefore higher borrowing by the government are inevitable. Further, Dr. Singh and Chakravarty write, and I quote, "There is a misplaced sense of apprehension that providing large cash assistance may deter people from returning to the workforce," end of quote. That's not all. They had suggested that deficit monetization should be an option which the government should adopt only as the last resort. Well, to talk more about the steps that the government could take to boost the economic activity, we have with us Praveen Chakravarty, the chairperson of the Congress Data Analytics Department and the co-author of the article that jointly been written by the former Prime Minister. Praveen, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. Before I get to the prescription on what needs to be done further for reviving the economy, let me ask you about what your own assessment of economic activity is. We just gave out the PMI numbers, and by all accounts, July, perhaps because of the reimposition of these mini lockdowns, etc., has trended to be lower in comparison to June. The government, though, does believe that while the pandemic continues to rage on, green shoots are visible, and they're basing this on high-frequency indicators, and railway freight and so on and so forth. Now, what is your own sense about what the GDP contraction could be? I'm quoting Ashima Goyal, who has just given an interview to Karan Thapar, and she believes that we could in fact see a GDP growth of 1% to -3%. That's the range that she's going with. She's a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. What are you working with as the working number for GDP?
Thank you, Shireen. I think the first thing we want to caution is we must have the humility to accept that we don't know. Nobody in the world, be it in the US or in India, can actually predict where economic activity as measured by GDP will end up for the year. We warn in our article precisely against taking either comfort or being alarmed by high-frequency numbers. Because these numbers, the world has not witnessed something like this, and we all know that. I know it's a cliche to say that, but it is a fact. In that situation, to try and come up with an estimate for economic activity or a GDP contraction is, in my view, a fool's hazard. We do know that the economy most likely will contract. I've also seen estimates where not just real GDP, but nominal GDP economists are expecting to contract. It's not something that we've ever faced. If nominal GDP contracts, it's never happened in independent India's history. We must remember that. So I think it's a mug's game trying to call whether it's going to be down 4% or 5% or 8% or 10% or flat. We just don't know. All we do know is there is tremendous amount of fear, insecurity, uncertainty across all sections. And that is why in the article, Dr. Singh specifically has somewhat warned us against getting carried away by these high-frequency numbers and implored everybody, including the government, to look at the bigger picture.
I agree with you that one should not get carried away by monthly indicators, but let me then talk about the road ahead. And you're very clear in this article that you have co-authored with the former Prime Minister that more needs to be done and more stimulus needs to be provided. And this is not the time for fiscal rectitude and fiscal restraint. Now, when you talk about borrowing, because you're very clear that there should be no deficit monetization, which is basically printing money, to put it simply, does it A, give you confidence to hear that the Economic Affairs Secretary Tarun Bajaj on record has said that this is not an option that's being considered? Does that give you confidence? And B, in terms of additional fiscal stimulus, what's the quantum that you're now looking at?
Yes, see, I think first, what sometimes when the crisis is so enormous and uncertain, the solutions perhaps can be simpler if we think with certain clarity. Essentially, what we've tried to say is for firms and for the economy, we basically need three things. Let's look at the economy from a firm's perspective, a firm's view of the economy or an enterprise. If an enterprise is confident of having customers for their product or service, and if they are confident of having capital for their investment and operations, then we argue that perhaps nothing more is needed at this stage. So just focus on these two. So if for firms to have customers, which is demand as we call it in the economy, there must be a demand assistance. I wouldn't even want to use the word stimulus because it's not about boosting something. It is about trying to get people to continue to maintain their livelihoods. So it is in that context that direct cash assistance is absolutely necessary. We point out that India is perhaps the only large democracy in the world that has not resorted to a large, significant direct cash assistance during this time. Now, I know you mentioned our quote about why we think there is apprehension and why we think that is misplaced. And I want to reiterate that this notion that if you give money to people, they will stop working, they will drop out of the labor force, they will not come back when they are needed, is absolutely without any basis or evidence. And which is why we quote the American example. 3/4 of unemployed workers have received greater, more generous pay and benefits under COVID-19 assistance than they used to when they were employed. And still, there is no problem in American industry reopening. So we must get over these fears and we must provide direct cash assistance. Now, the quantum of this, we have suggested in earlier articles, not with Dr. Singh, but I have suggested, along with former Finance Minister Mr. P. Chidambaram, we said the minimum is 7,500 rupees to 10,000 rupees per family for the bottom half of all of India's families. So that's a bare minimum. And then comes the capital part for the firm. Access to capital is very, very important. we completely laud the steps taken by the government and the RBI in terms of easing credit flow and enhancing liquidity. But we must acknowledge that that is not working. I have seen the RBI bulletin for the week of July 17. I've read the monthly bulletin. It is very clear there is no credit offtake. So this is not flowing through. And for that, we have to ensure it's no more about pumping more liquidity, but we have to ensure that we resort to certain institutional practices and give confidence. So that's number two. Once we do these two, then we will need money for these. I agree, though I think we suggest in the article that let us not rule out international multilateral institutions. We have a great track record and they have money available. We will be a dream borrower for institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So let us keep that option open. Now, with regards to deficit monetization, I think we are very clear. We've not ruled it out. We said keep it at the last resort. There is a reason we as a nation moved away from that in the first place. We must recognize why we decided to move away from deficit monetization. It does lead to what we've called unhealthy impulses of seemingly free money that can be created for governments. And neither should we be very hand-struck about not resorting to it at all. It completely depends. If the secretary has said that they will not resort to deficit monetization, that extreme position is also perhaps not a good one. We've said keep the options open, but make that the last resort.
Yeah. I think what the Economic Affairs Secretary had said that was not an option that was on his table as of now. So as you point out, it's an option of the last resort, which is what most people have been cautioning about. But Praveen, two specific issues I want to speak to you about, which is something that you have written about in your article, that there should be no intervention when it comes to the insolvency process. Now, what we've seen happen is that on account of the COVID-19 pandemic, the insolvency process has been put in abeyance. Now, you believe that in fact is going to end up distorting, creating an artificial floor, so to speak? Because some would argue that, look, for no fault of businesses at this point in time, they're going through a very difficult period. This is some sort of relief to them.
Yes. See, I think these are two separate things. The process of insolvency and bankruptcy, and the second one is what triggers an insolvency or a bankruptcy. Right? So we could certainly have flexibility around what we think is a definition of a trigger to an insolvency or a bankruptcy. All we are saying is there must be confidence among banks, bankers, regulators to do their job. We cannot put them in a limb where they are unsure what to expect. With frequently changing rules and constant interventions. It is exactly during times like these that institutions and processes must take over and function, because that's what brings credibility and certain amount of stability to the process. Now, if we decide that what will trigger an insolvency because of the extraordinary times that we are in will change, so be it. But make that upfront and clear, not change that on a monthly basis. But let the process of both lending and action against default and insolvency be consistent, and let institutions run on their own.
Since we're talking about regulators, Praveen, let me ask you about what your own take is on a restructuring scheme, an extension of a moratorium. Bankers that we've spoken to, including the SBI chief, are very clear that there is no need for an extension of the blanket moratorium. What could perhaps be considered by the Reserve Bank is a sectoral restructuring scheme. Where do you stand on that?
No, I am not in favor of any sector-specific interventions. I think we must have clarity of thought, which is why, why are we doing all of this? We are doing all of this as a liquidity measure. We are doing all of this to ensure that there is capital access. In our view, credit guarantee, a guarantee by the sovereign, is perhaps the cleanest way to achieve the same goal that a moratorium or a sector-specific intervention will achieve. And I think, which is why we make it very clear, the capital, access to capital. What is the end goal of this moratorium? That capital must be available for firms at this time. But capital is not available because banks are not banks are not lending, or they're worried about their own balance sheets. How can this be resolved? By the government stepping in and giving it a guarantee. Either give a guarantee for the banks in terms of capital adequacy, or give a guarantee for the end borrower. So personally, I am absolutely not in favor of any sector-specific interventions, and moratoriums perhaps were an immediate reaction that was perhaps necessary at that point in time. But I'm not sure that that is a very efficient or a clean way to achieve the end goal.
Okay, not a clean way to achieve the end goal. So, I want to end then by asking you about the demand assistance that you spoke of. And I think it's important to highlight that you're talking about, not stimulus, which is what industry is seeking or hoping for. But in your assessment, given where we find ourselves today, what would be the quantum? Is it 2%, 3% more? What do you believe will be needed to really get growth back?
I think first we must ensure, one metric that I would certainly look at is the consumer confidence index that the RBI measures. And the one simple goal must be to get consumer spending back to levels where it was before we entered the crisis. And that is not saying much, by the way, because as we point out, we entered the crisis in a very precarious situation. So what that would mean, what that would entail would really depend on how much lower we get. So I do agree with the government that, be open and flexible about the quantum of money. If we find that, we give a certain amount right now, maybe 1%, maybe 2%. I think we have personally said we can go up to 5%, but start with 2%, no problem. But be open about it. But I think it's the most important thing is to ensure that there is money to revive consumption back to levels where it was, and to inject confidence in people. Injecting confidence in people is very, very important, and we cannot possibly go wrong there.
Well, let's see when we see the next tranche of measures being announced by the government. This is something that is under active consideration, is what we're given to understand. Both restructuring, which is, of course, going to be something that the Reserve Bank is looking at in consultation with the government, and the next set of fiscal measures that we are given to understand is also actively being considered. Praveen Chakravarty, always a pleasure. Many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV 18 to take us through what the former Prime Minister and Praveen are recommending as the next steps to revive the economy in their OPED. Time now for us to head into a break, but when we return, exclusive conversation with RBI board member and chairman of Team Lease, Manish Sabharwal. We discuss the state of India's labour economy and what should be done to deal with unemployment. That and more when we get back.
Index numbers have just come in, and the July number is lower than what it was in June. It's come in at 46 compared to 47 in June. Both indicate contraction of the economy. Anything under 50 is contraction. The labour data from CMI also shows that after a distinct improvement in June from April and May levels, both the labour participation and the unemployment numbers have not improved in July. Well, I have with me someone who's best placed to speak about the state of the economy from the labour point of view. Manish Sabharwal, Chairman and Managing Director, Team Lease Services, which is India's largest staffing and human capital firm. Team Lease has over 95,000 employees in 1,800 cities and is implementing India's first vocational university in Gujarat. Also the first national PPP apprenticeship program. Manish is member of the RBI board. He's member of the National Skill Mission and the Central Advisory Board of Education. Well, Manish, I'm saying all this. Thank you first very much for joining me. I think Manish is at a vantage point when it comes to the labour market, and also he is on several policy-making bodies in an advisory or in a decision-making capacity. Well, first up, Manish, are you worrying that the economy is stalling in June, stalling in July versus June, or do you think things are on the mend?
Well, I think it's unmodelable. I think it is very irresponsible to put out unemployment numbers right now. First of all, India's problem isn't jobs, it is wages. But, you know, I saw the 28% unemployment number for April come down to 8%. I mean, that's like saying unemployment on Sunday afternoon is 75%, right? I mean, your office is closed. So when customers have been forced on strike, this kind of precision in unemployment is microscopically precise but macroscopically confused in my mind. I mean, we have to answer three questions which nobody on planet Earth can. One is around the virus, second is around consumption, and third is around professions. So the most important question is, are we at the start, middle of the virus? I think everybody has a model, but nobody can tell you for sure. Second is consumption. Will consumers be frugal or will they be hedonistic? Will companies be frugal or hedonistic? We've learned that you have to eat, but you don't have to eat out. I mean, so I think that the need, want, and desire sort of partition which a lockdown has done has important implications, and everybody has models, but nobody can tell you for sure. And from my vantage point, the third question of frontline professions which can't be done with social distancing. China's farm to non-farm transition happened to factories. India is happening to sales, customer service, logistics, hospitality, and construction. And those jobs can't be done. So I think the data is just too noisy right now. I think the noise to signal ratio will only become clear when we know when the lockdown is ending and when we have some visibility on the virus.
Well, before I come to policy, one other trend which people are pointing out too. In the early stages, we were all gung-ho about rural demand. One, because a lot of labor had gone back, and another because the government was spending more on MNREGS, the PM Kisan Yojana, and other programs which put money in rural areas. But now that feeling, at least one of the trends people are reading is that as COVID, peaks off in the urban agglomerates and goes towards tier 3 and tier 4 cities, rural demand is fading. Your thoughts on both rural demand and its fading hypothesis?
Well, it hadn't exploded in the first place. 45% of our labor force which works on farms only generates 14% of our GDP. So the only way to help farmers is to have less of them. So I think it was a little premature, if not silly, to believe that sending all our labor force back in agriculture would somehow be good for demand. So I think that a lot of rural economy depends on remittances from cities. So I think the spike in demand was, again, it was noise to signal ratio was misread. I think that obviously the crop has been good, but that'll create its own problems because of the oversupply in 2-3 months. The government might have to support prices. So I'd say that let's not look for magic bullets here. The rural economy is 45% of our labor force working on farms is one of the reasons India is poor. The only way to help farmers is to have less of them, and COVID isn't going to change that trajectory.
At the margin, is the credit guarantee of the government helping MSMEs? Now, of course, they have extended it to individuals as well. Is the government policy on the right lines, and is it working? Only for the incremental part.
Absolutely. I think that we entered this crisis with difficult fiscal conditions and difficult conditions of our banks. It is rational for banks to give 8 lakh crores to RBI every night in reverse repo, somewhere between 6 and 8, because this is not a crisis of liquidity, it's a crisis of solvency. Banks have lending powers, they don't have spending powers. So I think RBI has done what it could, which is reduce interest rates, give some liquidity, and do regulatory forbearance. I think the government has already sort of, on an aggregate basis, we have reached 11, 12, 13% of fiscal deficit. So, and the way to calculate those numbers in the US at 19 or Japan at 21 is not something India can afford. So I think that, we are not all dead in the long run. I know we can steal 10 lakh crores from our grandchildren and borrow that and drop it from helicopters. But I think that when we're faced with the kind of crisis that COVID is, which is an uncertainty, which is around how long and how deep and how broad it's going to be, I think the government's done what it could at the margin, and we obviously need to do much more around structural reform. I come back to that because there's no magic that fiscal policy and monetary policy can do. And I think that the US Federal Reserve expanding its balance sheet by $3 trillion in the last 4 months, or the US government borrowing $4 trillion in the last 3 months, are decisions that history will tell whether, such jerky reaction. Now that they have to withdraw the payroll protection program, there are various challenges. So I would be careful with, that we are in the ICU and don't talk about losing weight or quitting smoking. India has been in the ICU for a while. If a patient comes to the ICU every day, you've got to tell them to lose weight or quit smoking.
Okay, yes. So what you're saying is that we need to worry about debt to GDP in the coming years, and therefore there isn't, a deficit monetization by RBI or a fiscal deficit of 20% as options available at all. That's your point.
Absolutely. I think that would be irresponsible. I think that would be narcissism of the current generation. I mean, some sacrifices will have to be made because of COVID. Now, hopefully policy will ensure that the broadest shoulders carry the heaviest burdens. And that's why we come back to the prioritization of the vulnerable over the small employers, over sort of the diseased. And so I don't think that, borrowing 10 lakh crores or stuff that sort of has taken out of context that the US is doing this and Europe is doing this. I mean, our per capita income is $2,500. Let's behave like a country which has that. Let's aspire to $20,000, but let's not do short-term stuff that will hurt us getting to $20,000 per capita income, or even China's $10,000 per capita income.
Okay, now let's come to the structural reforms that you're talking about. What is something that the Reserve Bank can do first? Because, I mean, this is not structural reform, but the widespread expectation is that at the moment some kind of restructuring should be allowed. Is that at least something that the RBI needs to do?
I think that is premature. We don't need to make that decision right now, but I think that we have to balance the interests of borrowers and lenders. And, financial stability and financial inclusion are not conflicts, they are trade-offs. So I think that decision is not necessary at this point in time. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But I would say that any decision should balance financial stability and financial inclusion. One of the reasons that MSMEs and migrants have had so much trouble in India is that credit to GDP ratio is 50%. I think China's 300% is the wrong number, but we need to get to 100% credit to GDP ratio. So again, my advice, and I'm not speaking for anybody here or any institution, is that, sometimes short-termism hinders our reaching long-term objectives. So I would remind everybody that India is inadequately financialized, and the only way to get to a sustainable credit to GDP ratio is by being balancing the different objectives. Between 2008 and 2014, credit went from 14 lakh crores to 52 lakh crores, and we had a 12 lakh crore bad loan problem because of that. So I don't think banks have spending powers. Modern economy is something which has a lot more debt, and sometimes it is tempting to disguise lending as spending, but that's never prudent. And I think that we need to be careful as a society and an economy. It's not about RBI. I'm speaking as a citizen, and I'm speaking as an entrepreneur.
Manish, you gave us several large points. I think I have to invite you next time for each single vertical separately, maybe education one day, maybe removing compliance requirements another day. Thank you very much indeed for giving us a lot of things to chew on.